Hello, everyone. My name is Maziar, and I am one of the instructors for the course JBI010, Programming for Data Science. You have recently learned about some Python concepts, namely docstring, doctest, and pytest. We noticed that there might be some confusion for some of you on how to differentiate comments from docstrings and pytests from doctests. In 2 videos, I would like to share some more information about these concepts via an example. In this video, I will talk about the differences between comments and docstrings. Imagine that we have a programming problem which we are required to define a function called hit detection. This function is to detect if a point hits a circle or not. This function is looking for 5 floating point numbers as input arguments. These 5 points represent the x and y coordinates for the center of the circle, the radius of the circle, and the x and y coordinates of the point. We assume that all input arguments are floating point numbers, so you don't need to check for that. But be careful, the radius of the circle cannot be a negative point. If the circle radius is a negative point, then this function should print invalid inputs in the outputs. This function does not return anything, but it prints when the point hits the circle and when it does not. When it comes to solving this programming problem, I would like to start with asking a question. How would you solve this programming problem? Usually you will start with defining the function, check for a negative radius, and then to find out whether the point hits the circle or not, you need to check the distance between the center of the circle and the point. If the distance between the center of the circle and the point is less than or equal to the radius of the circle, it means that the point hits the circle. Otherwise, it means that the point does not hit the circle. You can see that in the first provided solution, which I would like to highlight it for you now, we write comments to explain part of the code which can be difficult for others to understand and also for us when we come back to our code later to improve it, for example. Now, I would like to ask you the second question. Is writing comments enough to provide a readable program? You might say yes. But how about when we have a bigger program with multiple functions? Later, when we have a bigger program, including different functions with different functionalities, we might need to go through all functions and read the code and comments which is written in their body to understand what's wrong there and what's wrong with their functionalities. Do we want this? Of course not, because it's time consuming. Actually, we use functions to divide our program into smaller chunks, program these chunks and reuse them in different parts of our program. So functions are there to make our programming life easier. We should look for a solution that if someone else looks at our code, or we look at our code later, we are able to understand the behavior of a function without going through the code, which is written in the body of this function line by line. This is the time that docstring comes to the table to help us. Docstring is there and are used to even make our programming life easier. Docstrings in general contains 4 different parts, which I would like to explain these parts via our example. The first part of a docstring is a short explanation of the behavior of the function. For example, in this case, and for heat detection function, we can write the behavior of this function as it detects if a given point hits the circle or not. Be careful and make sure that you use a full stop at the end of the explanation of the behavior of your function. The second part of a docstring is assumptions that we have made. For example, for heat detection function, we made an assumption that all input arguments are float numbers. The third part of a docstring is related to the parameters that we passed as an input to this function. For example, in heat detection function, we passed X and Y coordinates of the center of the circle. We passed the radius of the circle, and we passed the X and Y coordinate of a point as input parameters. The last part of a docstring called returns. And we need to use these parts when our function returns a value. In this case, for the heat detection function, because this function does not return any value, as you can see, the type hint for the return value is none, then we really do not need to have these parts or last part of a docstring. But for the sake of demonstration, I will keep this part here because then later you can refer to it. In general, if I want to conclude this part, having a look at our docstring and having a look at docstring in general, we should be able to understand what the function does without going through the body of the function and read its code line by line. Thank you.